Dr. Henrique, I have opened thousands of files in my 40 years as a lawyer. Contracts, wills, labor disputes, divorces. I have read pages where people lied on paper and pages where truth bled through the margins. But there is one file that changed the way I see evidence, the way I listen to mothers, and the way I judge desperation. It began with a spare key in the palm of a woman who smelled like stitch-marked cotton and boiled coffee. She handed me a shoebox, and I realized why she had to break the rules she had always lived by. If you care about real stories that don't fit neatly into courtroom dramatics, stay with us. Hit subscribe. There are things here that might help someone you know.
I remember the key as if it were a small, stubborn truth. It was the kind of key my daughter had lost as a teenager. The brass dull from being turned in so many doors. My fingers knew its weight. The spare had lived for years inside a tin labeled "Emergencies" on a high shelf above my sewing machine, right next to the spool of linen thread I used for hemming wedding dresses. I had always kept it there for one reason. No matter how old my children were, a mother keeps a way in. It was 10:15 a.m. on November 5th, 2023. Emily had taken a work trip to Sao Paulo. She had said it was for 3 days. Her husband, Claudio, had called, said he would take care of the dog. He promised to bring back the roses she loved. Those are small things. They are also the litany of how people tell you things will be okay. The hallway in her house still smelled of lemon cleaner and the faint floral soap she preferred. The apartment had always been neat. Emily's neatness was the inherited rhythm of my own discipline. But that morning something was off in a way like a note out of tune. There was a mug on the coffee table that hadn't belonged to her. There was a strand of dark hair on a pillow someone else's shampoo had left behind. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade with a blanket pushed aside in a way that was careless and intimate. I stood at the doorway and felt the room tighten around me.
I should have left. I should have locked the door and called Emily. I knew that even as my feet carried me forward. There are laws about entering another person's home. There are moral arguments about privacy and trust. There are lessons about right and wrong I had taught my daughter since she was small. But there was another law in my chest, a maternal urgency that moves before thinking does. I opened the closet because I thought, foolishly, that maybe there would be a note. Maybe she had left something that would explain her silence, her shorter calls, the missed Wednesday dinners. What I found was not a note. It was a shoebox shoved back behind winter coats, taped with tape that had left a ghost of adhesive on the cardboard. When I lifted the lid, the air inside smelled of dust and some cheap cologne that made my eyes sting. The box was heavy. Inside were photographs. Not the kind of photos you keep of birthdays and graduations. These were printed snapshots, close-ups of my daughter sleeping, of her face turned away, of a hand placed at the small of her back while she slept. There were screenshots, printed on common paper, of messages that ran from the clinical to the cruel. There were bank statements with numbers that made my head spin because they showed withdrawals and transfers on dates where Emily had said there was nothing to tell. There were receipts for airline tickets she had never told me about, and small receipts from restaurants she had not mentioned. Tucked under the last photo, my fingers remember the roughness, was a folded page with handwriting that read like a manual. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't love, it was instructions. I read the instructions with my mouth barely moving. The handwriting laid out, step by step, an approach to making a woman dependent. Keep her away from family. Control what she knows about money. Isolate her until she questions her own memory. There were dates next to some of the items, little checkpoints, and initials that matched the name on the nameplate of the man who had married my daughter. I recognized a pattern not because I am an investigator, but because I am a mother who had once watched predators work on the edges of our lives. The plan was cold and deliberate. There was on the page an economy of cruelty that cataloged how to make someone doubt herself until the abuser could quietly move through her life like a guest who never left. When I sat on the edge of the bed, the room let out a small dust cloud breath. My hands shook. I began to take photographs with my phone. I tell you this because in law, chain of custody matters. Who took what and when? I was not an expert in that. I was a seamstress, but I knew what my daughter would need. Proof. Dr. Henrique. In cases like this, evidence is more than a collection of objects. It is the bridge between what a person feels and what we can show a court or an employer. A shoebox of photographs can become a dossier if handled correctly. Photographs, printed chat logs, bank withdrawals with corresponding dates. When you connect them, a pattern emerges that can support claims of manipulation or financial exploitation. But there are rules. The fact that the evidence was collected by the mother in the daughter's home raised questions. Had anything been altered? Could the defendant allege tampering? That is why how we preserved and documented the items would become as important as the items themselves. Anna. After the third photograph, I was no longer surprised. The prints revealed images of another woman in the apartment, Tatiana, young, smiling into a camera my daughter would never take if she were awake and consenting. There were messages between the husband and the woman, messages that read like someone teaching someone else how to keep secrets. I saw transactions where money had moved from my daughter's account to a card I did not recognize. There were notes about appointments, nails, hair, paid for with a card that, on the bank statement, had been billed to my daughter. I sat on the bedroom floor and felt the apartment tilt. My hands closed around the shoebox like it was the only thing keeping me from falling entirely. I thought of the years I had spent sewing for other people's weddings, the ones I had stitched in the back of my small shop so that Emily's dress would be perfect. I thought of a widow's kitchen where we learned to measure grief and love with the same wooden spoon. My husband Roberto had died 10 years before, and for years I had been two people's strength. I had taken odd jobs, mending uniforms, hemming curtains, working late to pay for Emily's school books. When she graduated, we celebrated in a way that tasted of thrift and triumph. On June 15, 2021, she married Claudio. It was one of the happiest days of my life. The wedding had been modest. We had used every cent we had saved, my savings, second-hand furniture we could not part with, a borrowed bouquet that smelled of garden roses. We sewed invites with thread frayed at the corners. I watched my daughter walk into a life that promised partnership. I believed, like any mother, that the man who vowed to keep her would guard what was tender. It was not immediate. Control, I learned, doesn't arrive like a thief in a single night. It grows like mold in unnoticed cracks. At first, he was charming, in the way abusers often are, attentive, the kind of man who noticed the small things and praised her for them. He surprised her with coffee in the mornings. He memorized her order at the bakery. He told her he admired how fiercely she loved me. I clapped and cried because that kind of interest felt like a blessing to a mother who had learned to do everything alone. Then the small rituals began to change. Wednesday dinners, our sacred time, became irregular. A missed week turned into 2. Claudia was tired, she said. He has a big case at work. Then the excuses thinned into reasons that kept her away. Her calls grew shorter. When I asked to come by, he offered to pick up the food instead. He would say, with the ease of someone rearranging furniture, "She needs some space," or "She has a new schedule, she told me she needs to rest." I have a memory that keeps coming back. A Sunday in late 2022 when Emily failed to show for our market trip. She loved to wake up early and choose citrus. She loved to haggle. I sat on the bench at the stall with an empty cup of coffee and watched other daughters tug their mothers by the sleeve. My phone whispered a message. She can't come today. His name on the screen, not hers. When she finally came home, her eyes were tired but distracted. When I reached for her hand, she withdrew it as if from a scald. The small things, the way he answered for her, the ways her stories shortened, felt like spells. It is easy to shrug off one missed dinner. It is another thing entirely to notice the quiet pattern that swallows time. Dr. Henrique, gaslighting and gradual control are classic markers in abusive relationships. They often show up first as social isolation and then as financial control. A partner who insists on being in charge of passwords, who questions a victim's memory, or who makes the people the victim loves seem difficult is not always yelling or hitting. Sometimes the most dangerous strategies are subtler, replacing independence with dependency, shadowing decisions with doubt. From a legal standpoint, proving this pattern requires documentation, dates, messages, transactions that paint a cumulative picture. A single missed dinner is not evidence. A trail of changed phone numbers, blocked contact, and monetary withdrawals linked together can be.
I remember the night Emily and I cried together on my kitchen tiles after we came back from the city to buy fabric for a curtain. It was months before the wedding. Claudio had said something cruel in front of us, something about my age and how mothers need to give space. When Emily defended me, he laughed in a way that made her flush, and she left the room. Later, in the bedroom, she told me she was embarrassed by my questions. She told me I didn't understand the way love works. Those small heresies add up. There were other signs. Her paychecks seemed smaller. She would speak of money as if it were a fog. We had to pay some extra fees, she would say, then change the subject. Once, I noticed a purchase for an airline ticket on a Thursday, while she had told me all week she had been home. Another time, a withdrawal for a consultation that I could not place appeared on her account. I asked her office manager if Emily had taken an advance. The manager shrugged. Emily had not told anyone at work. Her identity seemed to be shifting in small thefts. It wasn't that Emily was naive. She was brilliant and careful. She had always been the kind of person to set aside change in jars and plan for rainy days. But control makes people forget the rhythm of their own care. Once he began to tighten the threads, she started to unravel. When I found the shoebox, I realized those little absences were not accidents. They were lines in a plan.
Dr. Henrique, for any lawyer stepping into a family matter, understanding motivation matters as much as the facts. In this case, the motivation for why a mother entered her adult daughter's home without permission was rooted in fear and the need to preserve evidence that might otherwise vanish. We are trained to advise clients to obtain evidence lawfully, but we also must reckon with the real world. When evidence is at risk of being destroyed, when an abused person is isolated, when physical documents risk to be flushed or hidden, those are pressures that push reasonable people toward desperate measures.
My confession here is not that I condoned breaking the law. It is that I understood why it happened. The question becomes, how do you fix what was broken without making the victim re-victimized by the process? Anna, I took photos of everything. My hands moved because I had to make a record before I could think. I photographed the handwriting, the bank printouts, the dates. I used my phone to capture the receipts, the restaurant names, the tiny notes in the margins of those printed messages. In the living room, I found a small key ring that belongs to a car I had never seen. In the closet, a stack of envelopes, bills paid with my daughter's card but addressed to places she had never been, told me that money was moving in ways Emily didn't control. I copied every page that fit in my phone's camera. I wrapped the photographs back into the box the way my hands would wrap a newborn. I remember feeling guilty for every scrape of sound the shoebox made. I told myself quiet lies. I'm protecting her. I'm preserving truth. Then I left. On my way out, his shoes were by the door, the expensive kind that I had always thought signaled success. My throat was tight. I felt an anger like heat. I did not know what I would do with that heat. I called Emily. She did not answer. I called again. The line rang, then hit voicemail. I could hear a voice in the background, someone laughing. My chest tightened as if someone had placed a hand over it. I left a message that teetered between calm and pleading. "Em, it's Mom," I said. "Call me when you can." I told myself I would wait 20 minutes. I waited 40. Then I walked down to the small bakery under her block. I bought sweetbread and a cup of coffee I did not want. I sat and felt the minutes fold into one another. When she finally called back 3 hours later, it was from a number I didn't recognize. She sounded like she was somewhere public. Her voice clipped, careful. "Mom, I'm at a friend's," she said. "I can't talk now." "Emily, I was at your house," I told her. There's something I need to show you." There was a pause I could hear even through the poor connection. "Mom, please." "I found things, Emily. There are photos. There's a plan. There are withdrawals." "Mom," she said slowly, the name like a shield. "Don't do this. You don't understand. You can't." "Who else is in the house?" She shut me down abruptly. "Please stop, okay? I'm fine." Then she blocked me. The call ended like a lowered curtain. Dr. Henrique. Being blocked by the victim is a typical and heartbreaking turn in these stories. The abuser often controls the narrative by controlling access. He knows how to manipulate the flow of information so that the victim appears to be choosing isolation freely. When a parent is suddenly cut off after a discovery, there is a legal and an ethical puzzle: how to preserve evidence and protect the victim without pushing them further away. My role as an attorney is to make a plan that respects the client's autonomy while securing their safety. Anna. I sat on a bench and held the shoebox like a confession. I told myself I would not go to the police because that felt like a trial before anything was certain. I considered calling his mother, Marta, who had always been kind to me at the edges of weddings and dinners, but I feared that would set off a fight that would hurt Emily more than help. I thought of the dog. I thought of the roses. I thought of the promises made on a June afternoon 2 years ago. What I felt was a tightness that started in my hands and traveled to my jaw. I am a woman who mends things for a living. I can smooth seams, I can make hems straight, but I could not mend what had been done to my child's life. I carried the shoebox to the one person I trusted to translate emotion into action, Dr. Henrique, an old friend and a lawyer who had helped our community in small, careful ways for years. He had been Roberto's neighbor when we were both young. When I walked into his office, the light over his desk made the dust look like tiny planets. I put the box on his table and told him, "I don't know how to do this without hurting her." He listened. He opened the box without alarm. He took out the photos with the kind of hands that have handled many papers in many trials, steady, not eager. He looked at the handwriting and at the bank printouts and at the receipts with a professional patience that made me feel as if the world had grown a spine. "You did the right thing by preserving these," he said quietly. "But this is delicate. If we take action, she may be hurt further. If we wait, something else might be erased. There are choices, and each one has a cost." "For me," I answered, "the cost of doing nothing is that she becomes smaller in her own life. I cannot watch that." Dr. Henrique. I told Anna then what any careful lawyer would say. We had to assess risks and benefits. The factual evidence was powerful. Photographs showing intimate moments without consent, printed conversations indicating orchestration, bank transfers that suggested financial manipulation. But when the evidence is gathered by a third party, by a mother, it raises questions a judge or an employer might ask about chain of custody. Could these items be shown to have been in Emily's possession? Could an employer be convinced that these were not planted? Those doubts are what the defense will exploit. Yet there is another reality to consider. Abusers often erase traces when they suspect exposure. They delete messages, they destroy receipts, they change accounts. Waiting could cost us irreplaceable proofs. My confession in that office was simple. I had thought I only represented companies and contracts for decades. I had not expected to be the person who would learn to read a mother's panic as evidence. But once the box was on my desk and the pictures stared up at me, my professional impulse kicked in. This was not only about law, it was about protection, Anna. He told me we needed a plan. He told me to breathe. He told me that I had acted out of love, and that the love was not an excuse, but a reason. He offered to make copies of everything, to catalog it, to timestamp the photographs, and place them into a file that would show exactly when each piece of evidence had been found. He explained what a dossier would look like in plain language. Photographs, printed messages with dates, bank transfers matching the screenshots, a sworn statement from me about how I entered the house and what I found. He said we should avoid posting anything on social media because that could complicate matters legally and emotionally. He asked if Emily had ever been threatened. I shook my head and then said, not in words, but in the way she moved. He also said something else that surprised me. There is a risk, Anna. Going in without permission could be used against you. The path forward will require courage and patience. There is no rush to courtroom drama, but there is also no time to lose. When he said no time to lose, I felt again the tightening in my chest, only now it was joined by a thin spark of hope. If evidence could be put in order, perhaps we could show a pattern that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore the truth. I left his office with copies of photos we had taken there, some filed digitally, some with little sticky notes where he would chart dates and cross-references. I remember the sound of the office door closing, like the closing of a hinge on a life that could be turned around. He walked me to the door and said, with a steadiness that both calmed and frightened me, "Whatever we do, we will try to preserve her dignity." I drove home with the box in my lap. The apartment felt smaller on the way back, as if the roads had closed in on me. I put the box under my bed because it felt like a sacred thing. I did not know if I was doing the right legal thing. I only knew it was what I had to do to keep myself from making the wrong mistake, doing nothing. That night, I tried to call Emily again. I left a second message, softer this time, remembering the many nights I had sung her to sleep when the thunder frightened her. I told her I loved her. I told her I would not push. I told her I would wait. My hands trembled just writing this into the phone. But fear does not wait politely for permission. The next morning, I found an email on my phone from someone I did not want to read. An unusual charge on my bank statement for a payment I had not made. And then a text from an unknown number that said, simply, "You should not interfere." It was not the first time a stranger's note had tried to mimic a threat. In the silence of my kitchen, with the sewing machine humming, it felt like a warning. Dr. Henrique, that message is the crossroads. As lawyers, we read threats as both evidence and intimidation. We must catalog them, but also contextualize them for our client. When a third party interjects in a family dispute with a warning, we must prepare for escalation, both legal and personal. It is my job to make sure the mother, who is now carrying a heavy moral burden, understands what the next steps could mean. Would we alert the employer? Would we go to the police? Both actions have different consequences. Employers may act swiftly if they believe company policy is violated. The police may take time, and victims often fear retribution. Choosing the route is choosing how to manage risk to the victim. Anna, I will never forget the way Emily's apartment looked that first morning I was inside. The cheap cologne, the mismatch of towels, the way sunlight fell through the kitchen window onto a table that had once been covered in fabric scraps from her dress. There were invisible lines there, places where someone's hands had rearranged things to make them less her. For weeks after, I replayed the moment when I found the plan folded like a map to ruin. I would think about it as if it were a short sentence in the middle of a long paragraph that was my life. I also thought about my own rules. I had always believed in lawfulness. We had taught Emily to respect the law. But when the law is slow and a person is immediate and unprotected, you have to choose. The choice I made that morning, using the spare key, was a choice I would answer for. I knew, in the way that gut-knowing people know, that this would not be a story with a clear, single ending. It would be messy, it would hurt, it would likely be judged by people who had never had to hold a child's fear in their hands. At home, I sat down with the box on my table and called an old friend, Marta, his mother, only to find that it closed wounds in a way I had not expected.
She did not take my news as a mother might. She asked to come over under the pretense of dropping off a casserole. That kind of denial is a small weapon in its own right. I told her nothing. There are alliances in families that will always complicate truth. When the sun lowered and my lamp buzzed over the sewing machine, I began to prepare a statement. It was not a legal affidavit yet. It was a note to myself, a way to make the moments fixed in time. I wrote down the date, 5 November 2023. I wrote the time I had turned the key, 10:15 a.m. I wrote what I saw, photographs, messages, bank printouts, a written plan. I wrote that I had preserved photographs with my phone and had taken them to a lawyer friend. My hands were steady while writing that list. The shaking had moved elsewhere, into a place that felt almost purposeful. I had turned an instinct into a record. It was the beginning of an account that could become a dossier, if guided right. I did not yet know what would happen when Emily finally walked back into my kitchen and saw the photos spread like evidence across my table. I did not know whether she would cry, accuse, deny, or flee. I only knew that night that I could not sleep with the box under my bed. I moved it into a locked drawer and placed a spool of thread on top, as if the ordinary objects of my life could anchor the extraordinary things I had found. Dr. Henrique. In the next phase, we would need to balance speed and discretion. Evidence can be fragile. Emotional responses can blow up the careful architecture of a case. A victim who feels betrayed by a parent's invasion may retreat entirely. At the same time, we had to act before digital traces were erased or before financial accounts were rerouted. My confession to myself, why this case stayed with me, was that it was not merely a matter of paper. It was a question of whether law could be used to protect a person whose autonomy had been stolen step by step. The day before I took the box to him, I replayed our lives in a way that mothers do. Frames of small hands and schoolyard plays, the way Emily had once cried because her doll lost a shoe. I thought of how I had told her to be brave, and then had sat on a bench holding a shoebox while someone or something felt bent on making my courage into an accusation. I had to decide. Would I force the truth into the open and risk making my daughter feel exposed? Or would I build a private case, a quiet file that could be used later? There are times when silence protects a heartbeat. There are times when silence kills. I decided on the latter. I could not let silence stretch over my daughter's life and suffocate it. I carried the box out the door. When I arrived at the lawyer's office with the shoebox this second time, the receptionist smiled as if we were only ordinary people with ordinary problems. The ordinary smile was a thin veil over the complexity I carried. I handed the box to Dr. Henrique and said, "Please, make it make sense." He opened it, cataloged, and then looked at me and said, "We will need to be careful, but you did what had to be done." His voice was steady, and his steadiness was the scaffold I hung my fear on. He asked me to describe exactly what I had seen and what I had taken. He told me we would take sworn statements and that he would preserve the digital copies with timestamps. He asked if Emily had ever had anyone she trusted outside the home. I named a few women from work and a friend, small nodes in a web that he and I could use to rebuild a picture of who Emily really was before this plan had been written across her life. That evening, I made dinner for one and set an extra place at the table out of habit. I poured wine into a single glass and looked at the ring of light on my tablecloth. There were lines of light and shadow across the fabric, like patchwork. I thought about the night we had chosen everything we could for her wedding, about the dresses I had hemmed and the vows we had listened to. I thought about the way promises can be altered into something else. I went to bed knowing there would be sleepless nights ahead, knowing there would be phone calls and possible denials, and knowing this, that when someone isolates another person, when they make them small in their own life, evidence often becomes the only language strong enough to break that hold. The next morning, the house felt as if something were waiting, an accountability that would require me to step outside the private clothes of grief and into the more public garments of legal process. My hands found the phone. I dialed a number I had not called in years, Not the defense, not the mother-in-law, but a woman from Emily's work who I hoped would be an ally. My chest burned with the knowledge that the next steps could either free Emily or push her further into silence. The choice ahead was a narrow bridge over a deep river, and I felt the wind of consequences at my back. Dr. Henrique. I told Anna then that the first formal move would be to create a dossier that established chronology and authenticity. We would not publish anything, we would not humiliate, we would prepare. The goal was protection, not spectacle. I knew, as any lawyer does, that the evidence she had brought me could be decisive, if handled with care. But legal battles are slow, they demand patience and strategy often requires sacrifice in terms of exposure, especially when victims are still navigating fear. Anna. I left his office with a stack of copies and a written list of what had to happen next. I returned home and wrapped my daughter's wedding ribbon around the box like a band. I did not know then whether this would be the last time I would hold it. I did not know whether the act of bringing proof into light would cause the worst storm or the calm after a violent sea. What I knew was that I could no longer pretend that absent Wednesdays and short calls were nothing. I had to stand in the doorway of truth, even if it meant the door would swing open into a room I would rather not enter. That evening, I sat with the radio low and the sewing machine silent. There was a photograph of Emily as a child on my nightstand, her hair in pigtails, a smear of jam on her chin. The photograph felt like an accusation and a prayer at once. I turned it in my hands and thought about the woman she had become, and the life someone had tried to redraw around her. I slept with the shoebox in the locked drawer, and with the knowledge that the morning would require me to step fully into a plan that could change everything. When dawn pinked the curtains, I felt both terror and a kind of fierce protection I had not known I still had. Dr. Henrique. After she left my office that second time, I sat at my desk with the shoebox's photocopies spread out like a map that had to be read carefully. The first task was preservation, digital backups, timestamps, and sworn statements. In plain terms, we made a paper trail that could not be blamed on anyone later. I dictated an inventory to my assistant. Each photograph received a number, each receipt an entry, every bank screenshot an annotation. Then I prepared a sworn declaration for Anna to sign, one that described, in her own words, the exact moment she had turned the key, the time, the place, and what she had found. That affidavit would be essential. It would show the court the context in which the evidence first came into our hands. We also had to think strategically. My years in labor and civil law taught me the power of institutions. Companies have codes of conduct, internal investigations, swift mechanisms that can remove someone from a position of authority faster than a court can issue a final judgment. An employer's action can buy time and reduce the immediate risk to a victim. The police would be needed, certainly, but criminal investigations move slowly. If we could create pressure within the husband's workplace, if HR could be convinced there had been misconduct that warranted suspension, that could limit his access to finances and power in the short term. I remember the moment I decided, quietly, to contact his employer's HR department. It was a choice that felt unorthodox. Lawyers often ask clients to initiate criminal complaints first. But the facts were compelling. Unauthorized withdrawals, receipts traced to the victim's account, photographs demonstrating intimate moments without clear consent, and a written plan outlining manipulative tactics. Those elements, when organized, suggested a pattern that a responsible employer might not be able to ignore. Ethically, I was transparent with Anna. I explained risks in plain words. If we notify HR, they may treat this as a personnel matter, I told her. They may suspend him pending investigation. They will also likely keep this quiet to avoid publicity. If we escalate to police first, the employer might wait. We have to decide what will protect Emily immediately. She chose protection. Anna. The first time I let the thought of his employer enter my head, it felt like betrayal, like dragging a private quarrel into broad daylight. But then I thought of the way a man who has power at work can use it at home. A salary that pays for an apartment, the ease of replacing cards, the confidence that comes from status. I wanted to take that away if it would keep my child safe. I wanted the brakes put on. When Dr. Henrique called the HR department, he did it the way a seasoned lawyer does. Calmly, clearly, with evidence organized and presented without theatrics. He explained there were reasonable grounds for concern about financial manipulation and misconduct that could reflect on the company's code of conduct. He offered to provide copies of documents under a confidentiality agreement, so HR could assess whether the situation warranted immediate administrative measures. They did not react the way a private conversation at a family table would. They reacted as a business. An internal investigator was assigned, an interim suspension was imposed, the man's credentials were temporarily limited. The employer's response was not justice in the courtroom sense, but it was significant. It meant that for the time being, his influence over workplace decisions was curtailed. It meant his salary might be stopped. It meant he was no longer an unquestioned presence in the circles he moved through. Word of that suspension, though meant to be discreet, leaked in the narrow channels that gossip loves. Martha, his mother, called me that afternoon under the pretext of returning an old apron. Her voice was small and fractured when she asked, "Is it true?" I told her only that there were questions being investigated and that I hoped for a resolution that respected dignity and truth. You can never make each relative come down on the correct side of history. Some will choose denial, some will choose to see. Dr. Henrique. With HR acting, our next legal step was civil, a request for protective measures and a divorce petition. Protective orders are intended to provide immediate safety, restrictions on contacting the victim, approaching the victim's home, or coming near places the victim frequents. They are often issued quickly if there is sufficient evidence of risk. We prepared an emergency petition that laid out the pattern of control, the threats, and the documented financial exploitation. Alongside that, we drafted the divorce complaint and a separate civil claim for restitution, asking the court to order the return of funds taken without authorization and to award compensation for the costs incurred by Emily to restore her autonomy. I will be clear, courts move at their own pace. Temporary protective measures, however, can be obtained quickly if the judge finds a credible risk. We stacked our petition with what we could prove: photographs, bank transactions, receipts, and Anna's sworn account. We requested an emergency hearing. Anna. Those days were a blur of practical things. I signed pages until my hand cramped. I sat in a small room at the courthouse and watched clerks take our filings with the same indifferent efficiency that wraps around any case. We did not scream. We did not make a spectacle. I learned to move like the machinery of justice, steady, slow, deliberate. I remember Dr. Henrique's hand on my shoulder in the waiting room as if saying, "We're in the right place." In the meantime, the space between Emily and me remained full of silence. I wanted to call her and tell her that every paper we filed had her dignity stitched into it. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed where the shoebox had once rested and waited for a call she might not make. When it came, it was from a number I did not recognize. She was breathing hard. "I read it," she said. Her voice sounded as if it had been caught under something. "I read the folder." Dr. Henrique. There are moments when evidence does what words cannot. In Emily's case, the dossier, the neat, cold files, did something that my words had not managed. It provided a reflected truth she could face. She had been living in a fog of coercion and fear, where memory was questioned and threats were thinly veiled. Seeing those bank records, aligned with dates, and photographs aligned with receipts, created a narrative in which she could place her own experience. That is what evidence sometimes offers a victim, the permission to believe themselves. When Emily admitted she had known bits and pieces but had been silenced, the admission came with a cascade of reasons: fear of losing the dog, fear of being accused of lying, fear of social shame, and above all, fear of the retaliation he had suggested would come if she spoke out. He had not always been violent.
His threats had been the slow kind: career consequences, reputational warnings, insinuations that she would be alone if she chose her mother over him. When power is applied gently, it is still power. Emily. When the folder landed in my lap and the pages fell open, I felt silly for crying over paper. But the papers were more than paper. They were the voice I had been taught not to use. For months I had heard him tell me that my mother worried too much, that I misunderstood things, that I was weak for clinging. He would say, "Let me handle this, Em. I know what's best." And I believed him because he was the only one who stayed when I did not understand how to be myself. He called me fragile, and then made me fragile. Seeing my own bank statement with withdrawals I had not authorized, seeing the receipts for hair and nails with dates I did not remember, seeing messages where someone coached another person on how to create an independent household, it felt like a map of my life with a stranger's handwriting across it. When I called my mother in the end, the words she had written in her affidavit were the thing that steadied me. She had signed, in black ink, the truth of the day she had opened the door. It was one thing for me to have a feeling. It was another to see that somebody I trusted had risked being judged to save evidence for me. Dr. Henrique. Emily's decision to return to her mother's home was not instantaneous. It was careful and fearful. She packed a small bag after midnight, using a borrowed phone. She left a note for a neighbor asking them to watch the dog. The neighbor, one of the small nodes of support we had identified, later gave a taped statement about unusual comings and goings at the apartment. Small community details like that can be surprisingly important. They show a pattern. When Emily arrived at Anna's door, she came with an exhausted look and a body that seemed to be trying to fit back into itself. The two of them sat for hours and tried to find the language again. They ate cold soup. They did not talk much at first. When she finally told us everything, about threats, about being told she had gone soft if she persisted in contact with her mother, her voice broke. That confession was both an ending and a beginning. On the day we went to the emergency hearing for the protective order, I watched the judge read our sworn statements, look at the transactional evidence, and make a measured decision. The judge granted an emergency protective order restricting the husband from contacting Emily, from approaching her home, and from entering any place she frequented, including her workplace. The order included a prohibition on disposing of jointly held assets without notice. It was not a final adjudication of guilt, but it was protection. Anna. When the order came through, something in my chest relaxed, as if a stitch had been completed. It did not erase the fear, but it was a legal anchor. For the first time since I had found the shoebox, I felt the weight of the moment shift towards safety. The protective order, however, is paper that must be respected. He violated it within days. He appeared at Emily's former apartment, asked the new neighbor questions, and leaned against the stairwell where the security camera caught him on video. He called in the middle of the night from blocked numbers. He attempted to access accounts, and the bank logs showed failed login attempts. Those brazen attempts made it easier to persuade a judge to take stronger steps. When that violation occurred, the police moved. They arrested him for contempt of the protective order. The arrest was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic and painful and, to him, humiliating. For Emily, it was a sign that the law could enforce its limits. For me, it was a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the immediate danger had been curtailed, sorrow at the degree of escalation it took to achieve that calm. Dr. Henrique. Arrests for protective order violations are, sadly, common in cases where coercive control is present. These arrests serve a dual purpose. They enforce the court's authority, and they create a temporary breathing space for the victim. For the legal strategy, they also mark a willingness to flout court orders, which can be presented in subsequent proceedings as evidence of ongoing danger and a pattern of disregard for legal constraints. At this stage, we filed the civil suit for restitution in earnest. The financial trail suggested unauthorized transfers and payments made using Emily's account. We requested the court to freeze certain assets and to order accounting of disputed transactions.
These are technical actions, subpoenas to banks, requests for transaction histories, calls for documentation. But they are the means by which money can be traced and returned. The court granted interim measures to prevent dissipation of assets.
Although the criminal case for any separate offense would proceed on a different track, the civil actions allowed us to pursue immediate remedies that could restore Emily's financial independence. In plain language, we were trying to make sure she could stand on her own 2 feet. Emily. The months that followed felt like moving through rooms of a house being renovated. Each legal step was a trade. We gave up something, exposure, time, privacy, for something else, safety, documentation, a path forward. I watched my mother's hands take the mail, sign affidavits, and make phone calls. I watched Dr. Henrique negotiate with the bank like a surgeon performing precise cuts. Sometimes the language they used, terms like asset freeze and service of process, sounded like machinery in a room I had once thought was only about love. Therapy began as a thread I did not always trust. The first sessions were slow, a cautious placing of words. I learned to name gaslighting where before I had only felt dizzy and ashamed. I learned to identify moments when my memory had been questioned. What he defined as forgetting was often a way to dismiss me. The therapist helped me draw a line between shame and accountability. That line would guide me through the legal meetings and through the small decisions of day-to-day life. Anna. During those weeks, our kitchen table transformed into Command Central. We laid receipts out like land plots and drew timelines in permanent marker. I learned to sit through conferences with Dr. Henrique without interrupting, to trust that his legal calm could match my panic. I played the role of witness and moral anchor. Emily took on the role of client and survivor. The neighbor who had offered her a phone in the night became a witness. People we had only known in the margins, work colleagues, a seamstress friend, a woman from the bakery, became nodes of truth. One afternoon, Marta came by with an old casserole as if to mend a rift with food. She stood at the door with a bowl in her hand and watched the photos spread on the table. Something in her face shifted. She did not say, "I'm sorry" at once. It took time for her to name what she had suspected or preferred to ignore. In the end, she sat with us, quiet. Her presence did not change the past. It offered a small, complicated form of acknowledgement. Dr. Henrique, trials are often dramatized in movies, but real change often comes before trial, in documents and in the quiet obedience of paperwork. The defendant's employer eventually completed its internal review and terminated his employment for cause. The company's policies did not allow for such breaches of trust when they implicated financial dishonesty and conduct unbecoming to the office. That administrative consequence had real effects: loss of income, strained credit, and a public stigma that affects social capital. It was not revenge, it was accountability. We proceeded with the civil settlement negotiations. Faced with evidence and the risk of protracted litigation, the husband and his counsel agreed to a resolution that included the return of funds we could clearly prove had been diverted from Emily's accounts, and a lump sum payment to cover therapy and moving costs. The agreement also contained terms that prevented him from contacting Emily directly and outlined a schedule for any remaining asset division in the divorce. It was not total victory. Law rarely grants totality, but it secured tangible support for rebuilding. There was also a criminal element, which, in our jurisdiction, required separate prosecution. The contempt arrest, the violation of the protective order, and the documented attempts to access accounts provided support for criminal charges related to that contempt and to potential computer-related offenses. Those charges, because they involved statutory elements and prosecutors' discretion, moved more slowly. But they were lodged, and the record of court-ordered sanctions hung over his head like a line that limited his options. Anna. The day we signed the settlement papers, I remember feeling oddly domestic, watching pens cross lines, noticing the light fall through the window like the first time I had hemmed Emily's dress.
The legalese on the pages could not contain the years of my stitches, but it offered a practical patch. Money to get her out of the apartment that had held such pain, to cover therapy, and to replace the little things that felt like memory anchors, her dresses, her spice jars, the small vases she loved. We sold the apartment. Selling felt like severing an artery that had fed shame. She bought a small, sunlit one-bedroom near the market where we used to shop. The seller knew nothing of the story. To him, it was just another sale. For us, it was a small sanctuary. Emily's healing was not linear. There were nights when she returned to the shoebox's photographs and felt waves of humiliation. She would call me and say, "Do you remember when I—" and then stop. We relearned routines. Wednesday dinners returned like a precious ritual. At first, we sat across from each other with plates mostly untouched, but the plates sat there and the light pooled on the table, and that was enough. Dr. Henrique. Perhaps the most significant change I felt was interior. I entered this case with the technical instincts of a lawyer: collect what you can, file what you must, argue what aligns with the law. But watching a mother's courage translate into evidence that could be used to protect a daughter moved me. I confess that this case altered the axis on which I judged truth. I came away with a renewed sense that legal work is not merely argument, it can be repair. It can be an instrument of restoration if wielded carefully. There are ethical limits to be observed. I will not suggest that anyone should break the law to obtain proof. I will not tell a stranger what to do. Circumstances vary, and so do jurisdictions. What I will say is this: when a person risks a moral cost to preserve evidence, the legal profession must respond with precision, honesty, and a willingness to use institutional levers that can protect lives. We must not judge a frantic search for truth without looking at the danger it sought to avert. Anna, healing included practical things: therapy appointments, financial counseling, learning to read bank statements with the confidence of someone who had once counted thread cones. Emily took a job that respected her boundaries and her schedule. It paid less for a while, but it paid for peace. She learned to say no in small ways, refusing dinners with people who had known him, selecting friends who asked questions that did not require secrets. She dated again slowly. Felipe entered her life like a daylight neighbor, respectful, with a steady laugh and clear boundaries. He did not rush to love her scars away. He learned them slowly and asked, with tenderness, how to walk beside them. We sold the house they had once filled with shared possession and bought small things for the new apartment: curtains that smelled of fabric store polish, a new set of plates. We kept the photograph of Emily as a child in a frame on the mantel. We did not banish the past, we reframed it. Months passed and the divorce became final. The decree included the agreed restitution and the standard division of marital assets. He was ordered to comply with the protective order and to continue certain therapy and monitoring as part of the settlement's terms, a procedural requirement intended to protect the future. He failed, in time, to meet the therapy requirements fully, and that failure became a point of further civil enforcement. The consequences were not theatrical. They were administrative and slow and, in their own way, necessary. Emily. One of the hardest things was learning to trust my own memory again. Gaslighting had not been a single moment, but a slow corrosion. Therapy helped me build a chronology that was mine. I keep a small notebook now where I write dates and events, mundane things like bought oranges, alongside large things like filed for divorce. It is a record for me, not for anyone else, but it anchors me. We restored Wednesday dinners and we made them sacred. We turned them into a ritual where we spoke honestly, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about bank statements and therapy. The nights when the conversation veered into uncomfortable territory, Anna would pause, make tea, and take my hand. There was no grand speech. There was only presence. Marta, his mother, visited less frequently as the years passed. When she did, she brought a small pie and sat at the corner of the table. She never offered explanations. She offered a domestic presence that hinted at regret. That kind of slow reconciliation is not a triumph. It is a recognition that families are messy and that truth often demands time. Doctor, to younger lawyers, I now offer a different piece of advice than the one I gave myself when I began.
Listen to the stories that come between the lines of contracts and wills. A mother's urgency is not always an ethical failure. Sometimes it is the only thing between someone and obliteration. We must learn to harness institutional levers, employer discipline, emergency protective orders, civil restitution, in a way that prioritizes safety while preserving due process. That is the professional confession I make. My practice was reshaped by a case that asked me to see evidence not only as paperwork, but as the voice of someone who had been silenced.
The years smoothed the edges without erasing the memory. Emily found work that made her smile in the mornings again. She met Felipe properly at a community class, a book club she joined because she liked the idea of reading without pressure. He was kind in a way that didn't require her to shrink. They dated. He came to Wednesday dinners and listened to the smallest details, the stories about fabric stores and how my hands once trembled when I was new at the sewing machine. He never pushed for the closed chapters. He asked about them and then let them be until she was ready to speak. A year after the discovery, on a gray Thursday, Emily and I sat at our kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a small notebook between us. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think I'm okay." It felt like hearing a piece of music finish. It was not the end of sorrow, but it was the end of immediate terror.
I was at the courthouse when the divorce decree became final. The paperwork felt obvious and necessary and strangely holy. The court's work is not a theater of vengeance. It is a sequence of checks and balances that, in this case, offered restoration. I will say plainly that the law did not heal the hurt. It built boundaries that allowed healing to begin. My confession is this: I no longer approach family files the way I once did. I listen differently. I catalog more patiently. I accept that sometimes a shoebox in the hands of a seamstress carries more truth than the polished testimony of an expert. I have become, to my surprise, more human in my practice.
There were moments when I still worried about judgment. People asked why I had gone into my daughter's home. People who had never held a child's breath in their hands found it easy to pronounce on ethics. But the ones who mattered, the neighbors, the women at the market, the people who had known us for years, knew the context. They had seen Emily come back to herself. They had seen the dinners and seen the small smile that returned to her face. Their quiet empathy was more meaningful than any passing condemnation. We began, slowly, to talk to groups about the dangers of isolation. Emily spoke to a small circle of women at a community center about coercive control.
She spoke plainly, without the need for drama. "It starts in little things," she would say. "An extra question about your schedule, a suggestion that you need space, a card that appears on your account." She would point to the ways ordinary life acquiesces to control, and then offer practical advice. Document, lean on trusted friends, consult a lawyer, and, if safe, preserve evidence. Final reflection. Dr. Henrique. The file changed me because it forced me to reconcile the letter of the law with the lives behind it. I confess that I had undervalued maternal instinct when it arrived in the form of a shoebox. That instinct is messy and imperfect, but it is often the spark that compels an injured person toward safety. My role was to make that spark legible to institutions, to translate a mother's panic into legal architecture. Anna. If this story has a final stitch, it is this: courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is a woman taking a small key from a tin on a high shelf. Sometimes it is a lawyer who decides that evidence must be preserved and that institutions must be asked to act. Sometimes it is a daughter learning to remember herself. To anyone watching who recognizes themselves in parts of this story, if you are worried about someone who is being isolated, or if you feel the weight of threats and muted shame, take small steps toward safety. Document things in a way you can. Keep copies of messages. Make notes about times and dates. Find someone you trust. There are legal tools that can help. There are people who will listen. You are not alone.
If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. If you or someone you love is in immediate danger, seek local emergency services and legal advice. There are organizations and hotlines that can help. Links and resources are in the description below. I will close as I began, with a professional confession that has become personal. I have opened thousands of files, but few have taught me to listen in the way this case did. The law is a tool. It is neither perfect nor infallible, but in the hands of people who care, mothers who risk shame, lawyers who will organize truth, clinicians who will help repair the mind, it can be an instrument of restoration. Anna. And to the mothers and daughters watching, keep your keys near, keep your voices ready, and keep your hands steady. Love is not always safe, but truth can be. Trust that the small things you do matter. We are still sitting across that same table most Wednesdays. The plate is full now. We speak, we pause, we laugh. The wounds are not gone, but they are scarred in ways that make us stronger. And to the mothers and daughters watching, keep your keys near, keep your voices ready, and keep your hands steady. Love is not always safe, but truth can be. Trust that the small things you do matter. We are still sitting across that same table most Wednesdays. The plate is full now. We speak, we pause, we laugh. The wounds are not gone, but they are scarred in ways that make us stronger.